I always knew there was something off about the crawl space. It was one of those lurking mysteries that everyone in the house seemed to tiptoe around, like an unspoken fear that we all shared. It wasn't until years later that I discovered why. It all started on a hot summer day when I was just a kid. My parents had gone out to run some errands, leaving me home alone with my sister. We had been playing in the living room for hours, but the stifling heat of the day had finally started to get to us. My sister had an idea. "Let's explore the crawl space," she said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. At first, I was hesitant. There was something about that cramped, damp space that had always made my skin crawl. But my sister was insistent, and I didn't want to be left alone in the sweltering heat. We grabbed some flashlights and made our way to the hallway. It took some effort, but we finally managed to pry open the hatch. The darkness below seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. My sister went down first, crawling on her hands and knees. I followed behind, trying not to think about the claustrophobic feeling of being trapped underground. It was then that I noticed something odd. There was a metal box in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. Curiosity getting the better of me, I reached out to touch it. That's when everything went black. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital with tubes and wires hooked up to every inch of my body. It took me weeks to fully recover from the accident. Apparently, the metal box had been covering up a hole in the crawlspace floor. When I had reached out to touch it, the box had shifted, sending me plummeting down into the darkness below. But that wasn't the worst part. As I lay there in my hospital bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been down there with me in the darkness. It was as if something had been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Years went by, and I tried to put the memory of the crawlspace behind me. But as I got older, the fear began to gnaw at me once again. It wasn't until one night, many years later, that I finally discovered the truth. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me home alone once again. As I sat in the living room, flipping through television channels, I heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. But then, I heard it again, a low scratching sound that seemed to be coming from the crawl space. Curiosity getting the better of me, I made my way to the hallway and grabbed a flashlight. As I lifted the hatch, a wave of apprehension washed over me. It was as if I already knew what I would find below. Sure enough, there it was, the metal box, still sitting in the corner of the crawl space. But this time, there was something different. There was a small hole in the floor next to the box, just big enough to fit a hand through. I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. I reached down and felt something cold and metallic. Pulling it up, I realized it was tape recorder, one that I had never seen before. The tape was old and worn, the plastic casing cracked. But as I clicked the play button, the sound of my own voice echoed out of the speakers. I listened in horrified fascination, as my own words told the tale of how I had fallen and hit my head in the crawl space all those years ago. But as the tape continued, I realized that the voice was not my own. It was a woman's voice, one that I had never heard before. It was cold and detached, like the voice of a predator. She spoke of trapping me in the crawl space, of waiting for me to die so that I would never reveal her secret. As the tape finished playing, I couldn't help but feel a sense of terror wash. I have always been afraid of small, enclosed spaces. So when I bought my first house, I knew I had to check out the crawl space before I could relax. It was the one thing that had been niggling at the back of my mind since I signed the papers. The hatch was in the hallway, and I knew I had to open it. But as I reached up to pull on the handle, my chest tightened, and my hands began to shake. I took a deep breath and told myself I was being ridiculous. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as I lifted the hatch and crawled inside. The air was thick, and the dirt beneath me was damp and sticky. I felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in around me. My flashlight barely illuminated enough to see where I was going, casting eerie shadows on the dirt walls. But as I moved further into the crawl space, my flashlight caught something. It was a wooden box, small enough that it could have been easily overlooked. It was nailed shut, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get it open. I was about to crawl out of the crawl space when something shiny caught my eye. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were dozens of footprints, small ones, and they went in circles, as if someone or something had been pacing down there, over and over. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't just a crawl space, it was haunted. That was the first time I had that feeling. That unmistakable feeling that something was there, watching me. And it kept getting worse. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear scraping sounds, like something being dragged across the crawlspace floor. Other times, I would see a shadow darting around the house when I was alone. But the worst was yet to come. One day, I came home from work to find that the hatch had been opened, and something had crawled out of the crawlspace. It was like a black, shapeless thing, huddled in the corner of my living room. It didn't have eyes or a mouth, but I could feel it staring at me, like it was trying to communicate something. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, frozen, as the creature slowly crawled back into the crawlspace. I knew I had to get rid of it, had to make it never come back. But how? I spent the next few weeks researching demons, spirits, and curses. I contacted paranormal investigators and priests, but nothing seemed to help. The thing kept coming back, crawling out of the crawlspace whenever I was alone in the house. I couldn't take it anymore. One day, I decided to go back into the crawlspace to look for something, anything that could help me get rid of the creature. That's when I found it. It was a small ceramic figurine, maybe a few inches high. It was in the shape of an owl, and it was old, so old that the colors had faded. I didn't know why, but I picked it up, and as I did, the world around me went dark. I felt like I was falling into a void of emptiness. And then, I heard a voice, the same one that I had heard in my dreams. It told me that the figurine was cursed, that it had been buried in the crawlspace by a witch who lived in the house a century ago. She had been disturbed, her spirit restless because of the footprints I had found. The voice told me that I had to bury the figurine in the crawlspace, that it was the only way to make the creature go away. So I did. I buried the figurine in the crawlspace, sealed the hatch, and waited. It's been a few years now, and I haven't heard or seen anything since. But sometimes, I still get that feeling. That feeling that something is down there, something that I can't see or hear but can feel it watching me. And I hope it stays buried in the crawlspace forever. It all started when my wife and I moved into our new home. One day, while I was tidying up, I saw the crawlspace hatch in the hallway. Being a curious person, I decided to peek inside. I had to crawl on my hands and knees to get through the cramped space. The air was musty, and the thick layer of dust that coated everything made me cough. As I looked around, I realized that I was the first person who had been down there in a long time. But as I was about to crawl out, I saw something that made me stop. There was a small wooden box huddled in the corner of the crawlspace. It looked old, like it had been there for years. I couldn't resist the urge to take a look inside. The latch creaked as I opened the box, revealing a collection of old photographs. Most of them were black and white, depicting people whose faces I didn't recognize. But there was one photo that stood out. It was a picture of our house, taken in the early 1900s, and there were 3 people standing in front of it. As I looked closer, I saw that the 3 people were a couple and their son. Something about their expressions made me uneasy. They looked sad, haunted, as if they were hiding something. I put the box back in its place and crawled out of the crawlspace, pushing the hatch shut behind me. That was the first time I felt like something was off about our new home. As the weeks passed, strange things started happening. Doors would slam shut on their own, and I would hear footsteps coming from the hallway when I was alone in the house. I started to avoid the hallway altogether, afraid of what I might see or hear. But one day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I heard a scratching sound coming from the hallway, like something was trying to claw its way through the floorboards. With my heart pounding in my chest, I lifted the hatch to the crawl space and crawled inside. The first thing I noticed was that the box was gone. It wasn't in the corner where I had left it. But that wasn't the worst of it. The footprints, hundreds of them, in a circle around the crawl space. They were small and delicate, as if they belonged to a child. I felt a chill run up my spine. There was something down there, watching me, waiting for me to crawl back out. As I crawled back up into the hallway, I knew that I needed to find out more about the family in the photograph. So I did some research, and what I found chilled me to the bone. The couple's son had died at a young age, and their grief had consumed them. They had become reclusive, paranoid, and obsessed with the afterlife. They had believed that their son's spirit was still in the house, and they had tried to communicate with him through the crawl space. There were stories of strange noises, of lights flickering on and off, and of voices whispering in the darkness. Some of the neighbors had even reported seeing a figure, a small child, wandering around the house at night. I couldn't believe it. I had moved my family into a haunted house, and I didn't know what to do about it. That's when I decided to try to communicate with whatever was down there. I grabbed a notepad and a pen and crawled back into the crawl space. My hands were shaking as I wrote my first question. Is there someone down here? And then I waited. Seconds turned into minutes, and I was about to give up when I heard it. It was a faint scratching sound, followed by a drawing noise. And then I saw it. A small hand reaching out from the darkness. I was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. The hand was small, too small to belong to an adult. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I crawled out of the crawl space as fast as I could, slamming the hatch shut behind me. My wife asked me what was wrong, but I didn't know how to explain to her what I had just witnessed. That was the last time I ever went into the crawl space. We eventually sold the house, too afraid to stick around any longer. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that small, delicate hand reaching out from the darkness, and I wonder if I will ever know what was down there with me.